Many of us teaching dispute resolution in the United States, one might wonder, why would Menachem Begin in particular have any residence or connection to dispute resolution programs in the United States? And one of the kind of striking things is that no matter who your audience is or which textbook you teach with in the US, the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt is universally used as an example of how to bring warring parties together, of the need to build relationships, of the importance of mediation, of a third party. All sorts of different examples have been told, and the books that are written about either the details of what happened at Camp David or lessons from Camp David, what we've learned from Jimmy Carter, from Menachem Begin, from Sadat, are all kind of throughout U.S. teaching on dispute resolution. And so for many of us, that has always struck us as the quintessential international example. And so given the opportunity to dive in and to talk more about that is something that we all were happy to participate in. So that's a little bit of the context of how the example is always used. And as I said, we'll dig into that. Our goals in this particular session are first just to really understand the basic principles of conflict. How do we get to conflict? What's conflict theory? How does that operate? And then conflict resolution processes. So we have one that was used at Camp David, but there are a host of choices, and to really understand the choices that are out there and how we pick among conflict resolution processes, what are the advantages, disadvantages, why we might have those. Then we're going to consider what lessons or principles of conflict resolution would really apply to current events here in the United States, current events in Israel, what's happening, what did happen with Camp David, and what's happened since then. And really, our final goal is that with all of this information, we have context to understand the impact of Camp David, the legacy of Menachem Begin, and how that impacts conflict resolution teaching and practice today. So to first do that, we'll consider the meaning of conflict, and Professor HINSHAW will lead us in that. We'll then outline different types of conflict resolution processes, and that will be Professor LELA Love. I'll then talk about a quick case study just to take us through the choices that we have in conflict theory and conflict processes. And then we'll turn to the current situation in Israel, where Professor MENKEL-MEADOW will give us some overview on that. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Professor HINSHAW to take us through our first subject. Thanks, Art.
Okay, there we go. So my job is to distill some key conflict theory points to sort of set the stage for the rest of discussion of this panel. I know that everybody has been in conflict in their lives. We know that it just is effervescent and it's just everywhere. So I'm going to ask you to think about some situations that have occurred in your particular life that can maybe help illustrate some of these. But first, we have to start with a definition. So what is conflict? Well, conflict, the best definition that I like, let's put it that way, maybe not the best definition, but I like this one of a perceived divergence of interests. And what do we mean by the perceived divergence of interest? Well, what we mean is basically that somebody's goals, wants, needs are incompatible with somebody else's. Right, so Professor Love and I might have a disagreement about something, and I might be thinking that she's keeping me from getting my needs met, right? And the key word here is perceived, right? Because she might not be doing anything. Like, she might not have any intention whatsoever, but boy, I think she's really bringing me down, and so I see her as the enemy, and I'm in conflict with her. And then she might not even realize this, right? And then somehow it blows up, and then there's sort of big confusion on her part as to why this is happening. But so I want you to keep the concept of perceived in mind going through here. With that definition, I want to talk about, well, there are a number of ways that conflicts can arise, and there are a number of different models, but I want to talk about two of them that I think are really easy to understand. The first one is incompatible aspirations, right? So what are the aspirations, the things that, we have to strive for? We believe we must achieve this, we must have this. And so our aspirations are not compatible. So what's an example? So think about this. You have water in a river. You have the people in the rural communities who need the water for irrigation of crops. You have the urban communities who need the water for living and drinking and sewage and all of these kinds of things. And everybody wants all the water. So that's a situation where we have incompatible aspirations. There's another one that is called relative deprivation, and I think it's really important. And it's this. It is taking an external benchmark and comparing yourself to it, but realizing that it's a negative comparison. I don't have it as good as that person does. So Professor MENKEL-MEADOW has that great space that she's in. She has all those books. It looks beautiful. I'm in my bedroom, right? And I might say, hey, why does she have it so good? I should have it just as good as she does, right? I have this external comparison. And then if I believe that maybe she's the reason that I don't have as good of a background or something along those lines, I can start to get indignant and get angry, right? And then, yeah, see, look at that great background that she has there. And so when I get angry, or my group gets angry, or if I have a business or anything along those lines, we get angry, we'll start to do things to express our anger, right? The other thing that relative deprivation does is it starts to get us to focus on losses. So loss compared to the status quo, loss compared to opportunities of others. Professor Love has this great background. She knows how to do this. I don't have the tech knowledge to do that, even though it's super simple, right? And so now I'm looking at losses and my inability and problems that I have to be tech savvy. But when we engage in a loss frame, people start to engage in more risky behavior. And this is why casinos make money, right? And so what do? I lose $100 when I go to the casino and I think, oh man, I need to get back to that status quo. I need to get back to where I came in. So I'll do a double or nothing bet, more risky behavior, right? So there are a couple, there are many, I shouldn't say a couple, there are many escalation models as well. And I'm going to talk about two that are related. And one is sort of the static version, and the other is more of a three-dimensional version of the same concept. And that is this, a conflict spiral. You're all familiar with what that might look like or what it might sound like. And you think of things like tit for tat, right? It's basically the idea of there's an action and a reaction. Action, reaction, action, reaction. And it just keeps going and going and going. And everybody gets trained psychologically that I'm supposed to respond in a certain way, which makes it very hard to not engage. If you don't react or if you don't engage, then it's perceived as being weak, right? And who wants to be weak when we're in a conflict situation? Almost nobody wants to sort of put that out there. And so, okay, we know that it's very hard to stop. And so it's very smart to try to stay out of these kinds of situations if you can. The other and the more sort of three-dimensional version of this is called the structural change model. So that's a situation where Professor Snyder does something to me, calls me bad names, and then what I do is I have some kind of a reaction to this. It changes something about me, maybe the way that I feel about myself, about the clothes that I'm wearing. I'm not as stylish as I thought that I was, anything that it could be, right? And so what do? I then use some kind of a strong tactic against her as well, which then causes some kind of change in her. And then that change then creates or leads to a heavy action by her against me as well. So you see how the conflict spiral is going. But what we're talking about now is how individuals are actually reacting personally or group-wise or nation-state-wise based on what's happened to them. So what kind of changes are we talking about? We're talking about psychological changes. We're talking about emotional changes. We're talking about attitudes. Suddenly our friends are now our enemies. We can get to a situation where we start to dehumanize groups of people. And if they're subhuman, then things get really out of control and we don't want to go there, right? So those are the escalation models that are easy to identify and see. And then we want to get to some resolution concepts that are very important. The first thing that I want to talk about is the Tom and Kilman conflict instrument, which is something you can go online, you can Google it, very easy to find, and you take their test. Is it perfect? Of course not. All these online tests are not perfect, but they do get us to some different strategies that people engage in when in conflict situations. So when we're in a situation where the stakes are low, the relationship is not that important, we can avoid a conflict in that kind of situation. Maybe the relationship is really high, like in your marriage or your family or something along those lines. You're going to just accommodate, right? Because the stakes are not as high. What's really important is the relationship. Or if we have a situation where the stakes are very high, and the relationship maybe isn't so high, like think of divorce, or maybe think about a situation like a sale or a transaction in a business, selling a business, right? Then we get to a competition mode, right? And we'll get into competition. And so there are two others that we conflict resolution professionals like to talk about, and that's compromise and collaboration. Why? Because it gets to the most critical concept in conflict resolution, which is the difference between interests and positions. So positions are easy. What's a position? Pay me $10,000. Like, I want $10,000 for my car. It's what people say they want. That's the position. The interest is the why. What's the need? So we could come up with several different possible needs here, right? One, maybe I just need to get my money back from what I paid for it. That's my need. It could be that I've looked at all of the used car buyer guides and it says that I should sell my car for $10,000 and I don't want to be taken advantage of, right? Or it could be that my wife has had this terrible medical accident, or not a medical accident, but she had an accident really that brought about big medical bills, and I'm looking for a way to pay off those medical bills. So what is the need? And this is the way that we get there. We do two things. One is we ask the question, why? We don't always say why, because if we say why all the time, what do we sound like? We sound like a 3-year-old, and it gets old, right? So we have to come up with different ways and just say, so that's one way, asking why. The other is when somebody's talking is to say this, tell me more. Tell me more about that. That's super interesting, right? And when people talk, you get to find out the story behind the position. So when you find the story behind the position, then you should be able to identify the interest. Much easier said than done. And speaking of done, that means I'm done. So I'm going to hand it over to Professor Love. LELA, take it away. Lead us on some of the different conflict resolution processes.
Thank you, Art. That was wonderful. First of all, let me say it is such an honor to do anything associated with the name Menachem Begin. What a fabulous human being, and to have a bit of brush with his legacy is tremendous. So thank you. And to be with my wonderful colleagues, Art, that was a great start for this. So I'm going to talk about methods of conflict resolution. I would say it is as important how you resolve a conflict as it is important what the conflict itself is. Depending on what you do, you can create new conflicts, you can make new allies, you can create new enemies, you can increase enmity or hatred, or you can create increase friendship, you can bring peace, you can bring war. So let's look a little bit at the how you resolve conflict. First, what are the possibilities? One possibility with the conflicts that Art so wonderfully laid out, you can do nothing. You can relax, you can take it easy, you can see what happens next. Or you can talk. And that is another way of saying you can negotiate. We'll look at that in a bit. You can mediate. You can bring in some expert like CARRIE, MENKEL-MEADOW, to help you talk wisely. Or you can arbitrate. You can bring in a wise, worldly person like Andrea, I called you that, to decide the matter for you, an arbitrator. You could litigate, take them to court, or you could go to war. There's a whole array of processes. And to make it sort of organized, let's look at this array with a few big questions. Question one, who decides the outcome of the conflict? In some of the processes, there is an other person, an other entity who decides. For example, in litigation, a judge decides, a court decides, a jury decides. In arbitration, if you choose carefully, some smart person like Professor Schneider decides the outcome of the dispute. It's important, right? If you give your conflict to an other, that you get a good judge. Do keep in mind that's dangerous. You can't control that other. To divide the world in a simple way, the other big options is the parties themselves decide. You decide if you're in a conflict, how it works out. And that would be the negotiation, the talking process, mediation. The parties decide themselves the outcome. It's a little safer because you keep control of the outcome if you're the decision maker. What is the nature of the different processes? Well, we've mentioned on the one hand, processes where a neutral decides, arbitration and litigation. Those processes are adversarial. What that means is it's your job, if you're a party in such a process or a lawyer, to convince the decision maker that the other side is wrong and your side is right. It's a war of sorts, an intellectual war. On the other hand, in negotiation or its sister process, mediation, you're looking to convince the other side. It's a consensual process. You want to get the other side working with you, as was done at Camp David, to work out a resolution that works for both processes. So on the one hand, you have adversarial processes that are inherently structured so that each side tries to make their best case. So a judge or jury or neutral decides, and the consensual processes structured towards making the parties decide. By the way, I didn't mention why I have this palm tree background, not usual for me. The first time I've ever used it, I'm in Florida. My first day in Florida. I'm so thrilled about that. Let me tie it to what I just said. In a process where you're trying to get parties to connect with each other, to relax, to talk, consensual processes, everything matters. Where you cite the process, what people eat, etc. In an adversarial context, a process where you're trying to convince a neutral, you want to be as impressive as you possibly can be about your case. I'm checking my time. Okay, what sort of outcome do different processes allow us? In an adversarial, to simplify, an adversarial process promises us finality. That is, in a litigation context, or an arbitration context where we ask a judge, am I right? Is that Art Hinshaw wrong? The judge, we hope, will say, LELA, you are right, you win. Of course, it's dangerous because the other side has an equal shot at winning. In a consensual process, the outcome ideally is the famous win-win. Now that's a little naive that we both can win, but I'm not going to agree to anything, nor is Carrie or Art or Andrea, unless it's a win for them. So if we come to an outcome that we all agree, we've got a win-win, or we get nothing, and we can go back to an adversarial process. Typically in a litigation or an adversarial process, arbitration, it's rights-based. We give proofs, we make arguments. The decision maker makes a decision based on our rights. Whereas in a consensual process, we talk about what we need, what we want, why we want it. We try to convince the other side. To go back to Art's points about interests, it's an interest-based process. So in conclusion, in conclusion, the rights-based adversarial processes of particularly litigation, courts, and so on, are based on the rule of law and ordered society, frequently precedents, depending on what country you're operating in. And that's the justification. If you look at negotiation mediation, the goals they achieve include more tailored outcomes, sometimes more durable outcomes, better relationships sometimes, stronger communities sometimes. And what I haven't mentioned, I'm sure my incredible colleagues will be mentioning, is the costs. And some processes can take a lifetime of wars, of deaths, of injuries, of families destroyed. Some processes cost so much that whatever the dispute was worth, you're poor by the time the process itself is done. So, final word. The process is as important as the conflict. Get good advice before you decide what route to take. Back to you, Andrea.
Thanks, LELA. That sets this up perfectly. And what I'm going to do in my allotted time is to use a little bit of a case study just to see how some of these implications of conflict theory and our process choices can play out. The example that I'm going to use is the security barrier / fence / wall. And you can already see by the fact that we can't define exactly what is between the Israeli and Palestinian territories in Israel, tends to demonstrate exactly how much of a conflict this is, right? There's even a dispute in the literature, depending on what newspaper you're reading, on what we're calling the security space, as it were, between the groups. And I should say the other part of framing this, of course, is that we're looking at this particular issue, and we'll look at different processes as it's used. And we should recognize that, of course, it's part of the whole issue of a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And so this is just one piece of it as we're trying to assess this. The first thing to look at, the security barrier, and I'm just going to call it that for purposes of this talk, is the choice of litigation, right? That one could be adversarial, and both human rights organizations in Israel, Palestinian groups, the Palestinian Authority, all took the position that this was illegal, took an adversarial position, to put it in Art's terminology as well, and went to court to stop it. So they chose a litigation process. But interestingly, of course, there were there's more than one court they could choose and that they did choose. So there was litigation both on the domestic side, right, up and down the Israeli court system and through the Israeli Supreme Court more than once. And there was also a court brought in front of the International Court of Justice asking for an advisory opinion back in the early 2000s. Thinking about what are our goals, what are we trying to accomplish, what are our choices there, right? The parties that brought the case are already deciding that they want to be more adversarial, that they assume that a court, right, they're not going to have a consensual decision, that they want a third party to be making the decision to tell the Israeli army, the Israeli government to stop building. Right? So they're not looking to try to negotiate or to figure out where it should be. It's an all or nothing, at least initially, right? This should not be here. This is illegal, which was what they were trying to accomplish. And in front of the International Court of Justice, one could argue they were successful. The advisory opinion said that the security fence barrier was illegal under international law. Interestingly, the one dissent was from the U.S. judge at the time, Thomas Bergenthal, who himself is a survivor of the Holocaust and had his own obvious background in taking to this. So that was very interesting to read his own dissent. For the lawyers listening, have fun, right? That's a really wonderful opinion on both the pros and cons of litigation. But it still doesn't resolve it, right? It didn't actually, because it's an advisory opinion and because the government of Israel didn't participate, it wasn't a decision that they were following. On the other hand, litigation in the domestic court did end up having some impact on the Israeli government as the decisions came back and forth in terms of how they could build and where they could build. And so again, thinking about what are you trying to accomplish, who's making that decision, and what the impact will be. At the same time, when we look on the flip side, as LELA said, at the consensual processes, you could also see that there were different types of third parties, different groups that were trying to both negotiate and mediate the placement of the security fence. How broad did this have to be? Where was it exactly laid out? Whose property was taken? What was compensation for taking it? Was it a fence? Was it sand? Was it a barrier? Could you see through the barrier? How high was the barrier? Right? There were a lot of details that were and could be negotiated when parties sat down to really do the exact mapping. And I'm not saying this, anybody on the ground knows this already. The map changed over time. And arguably the map changed over time, not only because of the adversarial litigation processes, but also because of some of the consensual processes and frankly also experience in terms of what was needed. And as it was built at the beginning in the early 2000s, really at the height of the Intifada and bombings and things like that, versus the pieces that were built later on. And when the number of bombings, frankly, had also reduced. That kind of consensual process was very interesting to watch. And again, I'm going to subdivide it even further and lay this out because Carrie will be finishing up on this. When we look at whether those are individuals, right, was a human rights organization representing an individual Palestinian farmer with olive trees, lemon trees, whatever it was, where that barrier was going. And was it an individual need trying to find a way of, it's going to be built, I'd like it built this way versus that way, versus were we looking at consensual processes in which there was grassroots organizations from environmental groups, peace activists, where they were trying to represent many individuals at the same time, and the impact of those consensual processes really on a grand scale. What we would call really public policy mediation or public policy negotiation. And in some instances in this particular case, it was hard to know who the decision maker was, right? Even if you were getting organized with the environmental groups, who in the Israeli government or the Israeli army had the actual power to say, yes, no, maybe, here but not here, there but not there, whatever it was. And so really thinking about how those details of a consensual process can work out are, right, part and parcel in and of themselves, decisions to be made and points that are arguably confusing all at the same time. And of course, this is all laid on the fact that this is just a piece of the conflict, just one element of what the Israeli government, the Palestinian Authority, peace activists, grassroots organizations are all trying to figure out at the same time. The last piece that I want to highlight when we use the security barrier as an example of the choice of processes that the parties could make and did make over the course of its building is to really think about the goals that were achieved. LELA started us off thinking about litigation, that one of the goals can be the rule of law. And clearly for some parties, going to the International Court of Justice, for example, the goal is to get a rule of law, to demonstrate that there is an international law here and that the norms of international law were violated. And yet, as we know, when it comes to Israel, its trust and belief in the international system, anything operated under the United Nations, is rightfully suspect. And if you're not buying in to this so-called rule of law, then the goal, right, of the Palestinian Authority in bringing the case, right, isn't achieved if what their goal was to get a ruling that Israel was going to change its behavior. On the other hand, if your goal was to, in the international public court, make Israel look bad, this was just another venue for whether, the General Assembly already has its regular resolutions that are anti-Israel. Here was another venue in order to slam Israel. And so parsing what the goals are of our actions as we're dealing with conflict are also really important. On the other hand, the goals of bringing litigation in the Israeli Supreme Court was, in fact, to have that rule of law and to have guidance from the Israeli court on where and how and when this barrier could be built and what parameters were needed. And so to think about the parties and their accomplished goals in that particular instance. And then again, when we look at consensual processes, the goals were often to help an individual or a set of individuals quickly, cost effectively, and in a way that was tailored to them. And so again, in thinking about that, if you were an individual looking at a situation, do you want this in court? Do you want the rule of law? Do you want the global recognition or approbation? Or are you trying to save this tree? And understanding the goals of the parties as they're going into these processes and making these choices is really one of the most important things to understand. So with that, Carrie, setting us up from this example and then taking us more broadly into Israel, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thanks, Andrea. Let me say what others have said. It's a great honor to be here and to talk about these issues. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's put this together and to my dear colleagues from whom we all learn from each other all the time. My own experience here as a conflict resolution theorist, teacher, and trainer for many years was really challenged when, starting in 2007, I began to come to Israel almost on a yearly basis, initially to teach mediation and dispute resolution at the University of Haifa Law Faculty. And then, because of my work in Washington, to get pulled in to some of the issues at the high level, national level, as various people in the State Department were working on formal kinds of diplomacy. So I have two themes here for you, for those of you who are listening to me, and that is the importance of linkage. And I want to pick up on the processes that LELA described and the methods, and the concrete example that Andrea provided in the security barrier wall dispute, to say that I had, and this is my second theme, the vertigo experience of working at both the grassroots level and at very high levels of attempted diplomacy with the U.S. intervention, European Union, and what some have called the peace industry. Lots of money pouring in from the European Union and from the USAID and the State Department as a very big-footed mediator, as LELA would describe mediation. We sometimes in international dispute resolution call that muscle mediation. What authority, what force can the United States use by providing funds, as they did in Camp David, providing funds to Egypt repeatedly over the years in order to ensure the peace by providing funds for demilitarization and policing of the Sinai, And so the question that I want to present to you by giving you some examples for all of you who are listening. I come out of my own feeling of vertigo of having worked with incredibly moving grassroots efforts, which I'll describe briefly, and at the high levels of diplomacy. The issue for me became linkage. How can we take the processes that LELA has described and the conflicts that Art has described and the specifics that Andrea has described, when they operate at different levels, how can we bring them together? Those of you who live in the region know there will be no peace unless the leaders agree and people on the street on all sides agree to abide by some sense of peace. So the challenge in the application of conflict resolution theory and practice is how do we make it work? I'm a theoretician, but I'm more importantly an American pragmatist. How can we bring these things together? So briefly, let me just say, as I told you, I taught law students, I taught diplomats, I ran some seminars through USAID to try to teach leaders how to think and use the theories that Art and LELA have described. And then I got involved with a number of grassroots organizations in Israel. So if anyone from my dearly beloved parent circle is online, hello. I started working with a number of people on the Palestinian and Israeli side. The Parent Circle is a group, many of you know about it, in which all the members have lost someone in the conflict. And I spent a little bit of time going back and forth into the West Bank and from Israel and facilitating and helping with a series of mediative events at a people-to-P2P, we call it, people-to-people level. And as others on this call know, there have been other examples of that, a whole lot of efforts at sports. So some of you might know there were efforts to bring Israeli and Palestinian kids together on the Haifa campus to play basketball. The film Promises, which is one of my favorite films, was an effort just before the first Intifada to bring Israeli and Palestinian kids together to play soccer. An incredibly moving film, again, children to children. And the film very nicely displays how the children try to approach each other while their parents present a whole range of political views, from settlers who say this is our land to very liberal parents who allowed their Israeli children to go across the border and play soccer on the West Bank. Extremely moving films, and this has been done in basketball and soccer and a number of other sports. Similarly, some of you may know in the United States, the Seeds for Peace camp, which brought people from Israel and Palestine together here in various camps in the United States. Again, the hope that if you train the new generation to work together, to talk together, to play together, they might create a new world. And at the mid-level, the level I'm most interested in, the educational level, some of you may know Thomas Friedman's famous book, From Beirut to Jerusalem. There's a lot in that book, but if you haven't looked at it for a long time, look at the introduction. Thomas Friedman studied at Oxford at a table where there were people from all over the Middle East. He spoke Arabic and Hebrew. And his hope when he was in graduate school was that the new generation would form that mid-group. Some of them would rise to be leaders in their countries and work in the government or become professionals or teachers. And his hope was it was those of us, and I put myself in that category, at this mid-level that would educate and work with the junior generation and also have a little bit of influence with our own nation's leaders. And we would try to bring all these levels together. That remains an enormous challenge. And I hope I'm not being too controversial here, but the United States has just finished with a very controversial leader, and you in Israel are still dealing with your controversial leader. Leadership matters. And one of the challenges for me in working at the higher levels, training diplomats, is the extent to which so many of our leaders and diplomats think that they know this stuff that we are trying to talk to you about this morning. Leaders engage in conflict every day, from managing their own offices to dealing with other leaders. And the truth is, very few of them have actually been trained. They haven't had Art or LELA or Andrea or me teaching them about when is it appropriate to negotiate directly with a leader from another country. That's what happened at Camp David successfully. And let me tell you, Jimmy Carter had a lot of instruction from the Harvard program on negotiation, among others. Andrea's teacher and all of our mentor, Roger Fisher, was there. The various people in the State Department were teaching Jimmy Carter both negotiation and mediation skills. And they used a lot of techniques that we use in mediation. That is, sometimes joint sessions. There weren't too many. Begin and Sadat did not love each other. And so Jimmy Carter used another particular process that's included in what LELA described as mediation, caucusing. And Jimmy Carter went from cottage to cottage and used another technique we use in our field, a one-text procedure, in which he would put proposals between the two leaders, and the proposals wouldn't come from either side. Another concept that Art might have mentioned is the important concept for us of reactive devaluation. Anything Begin proposed, Sadat would reject. Anything Sadat would propose, Begin would reject. Why? Because they are the other, adversarial. I cannot accept what my enemy is proposing. So in mediation, we learn that a third party can come in and make suggestions, not decide anything, that's arbitration, but make suggestions and try to make them more neutral. So the challenge here, as I've said before, is for those of you who are interested in bringing peace and in working in this field, I think we have a very interesting set of issues for us to explore linkage. How do we teach the leaders and the diplomats to understand these concepts and then work with what is often the goodwill that we can develop through these programs and develop something, I don't know if we call it M to M, middle person to middle person, that we need some mid-level engagement so that the diplomats listen to the grassroots. And to follow up on what Art said, what do people on the ground need and want for peace? And how can we try to bring those levels together? So as an educator and a practitioner in the field, and for those of you who are trying to help, I put to you the challenge, how can we bring these levels together and make use of the processes, theories, and strategies that we've heard this morning and bring them together in some productive way? Thanks very much.
Thanks, Carrie. That is great. Art, in thinking about current Israel as well as lessons from Camp David, I'd love your thoughts and reflections. And so, Art, I'll turn this back to you.
Okay, so I'm not as up to date as others on the situation on the ground in Israel, but I paid close attention here in the United States to some things. And I want to, Carrie mentioned leaders think they know conflict and how to work with it and things along those lines. And I want to bring up something that I think is really interesting happening in the United States. And that is what Joe Biden did throughout his campaign and seems to be doing now. And he's giving everybody in the world a masterclass in how not to, basically a non-escalation, how not to get pulled in to the, the cycle of conflict that we were discussing about earlier. Because, boy, people are trying to get him. They're pulling. We got his son. Let's do this with his son. Let's, do that. He's got people are like slamming him for dogs and things along. It's a rescue dog. It's not a real dog, all this kind of stuff. And he's not letting it impact him at all, right? Because he knows, I guess intuitively maybe, or maybe just of his experience as a politician and being a part of some of these high level conversations that Carrie was talking about, conflict spirals are so hard to get out of, and he doesn't want to be in it. And I presume this is a conscious choice. And as a result, I think I'm impressed by this. I am very impressed. So that's my 2 cents there, Andrea.
Well, I appreciate it. And the idea of leadership actually is not just leading into conflict, but actually saying, I'm good, right? And I mean, the example about the dog is classic of, right? One could totally get all over Twitter and be like, my dog is beautiful and blah, blah, blah. All right, forget it. Just move on and enjoying the quiet, as it were. LELA, your thoughts?
Oh, one thing that always strikes me in Israel is how discouraged many people can be about that the conflict there is being intractable, is being unresolvable, is being different. And I'm always reminded of Northern Ireland that had that same characteristic, that endless dispute between Catholics and Protestants that went on. And it got resolved. It got resolved ultimately with the help of mediation, or South Africa is another example. And one never knows what that tipping point is. You know, I always think, yeah, it's a really tough conflict, and a lot of people have tried very hard to resolve it. So Desmond Tutu, who is the Archbishop, Anglican Archbishop in South Africa, involved in Truth and Reconciliation, said in one speech I heard, there is no intractable conflict. They all are resolvable. And George Mitchell, the Northern Ireland mediator, said, humans created conflict, humans can resolve conflict. So I would say, you know, in our Q&A, one of the questions is, well, we know how to get sort of liberals to the table. How do we get others to the table? So we look at these other situations, you know, there's a tipping point created by perhaps funds from third parties who create opportunities, by suddenly people caring about their international reputations, caring about world opinion, as happened, I think, in South Africa. Their BATNA is being poor. Now, for those of you who don't know, BATNA is best alternative to a negotiated agreement, a term from getting to yes. Sometimes you get forced to negotiate, to be reasonable, by your other alternatives getting worse and worse and worse. So that's one way to get people to the table. The costs of not settling, not coming to an accommodation, keep growing. So I'm very hopeful about Israel. It will get resolved. I hope it gets resolved before more and more damage is done. Just one quick point to add to what Carrie said. So Seeds for Peace, which has camps in the United States and brings kids together from all over the world, is now doing a whole nother initiative in Israel. Actually, it's not brand new, of taking young people who were trained at Seeds for Peace and turning them into facilitators and putting them back into their communities. So there's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Leila. I like that. The M to M, right, of the Seeds for Peace is actually creating that M to M. Carrie, we're going to do M to M in honor of MENKEL-MEADOW and M to M. So we can just, you know, we can do all of those fun things. It's just going to be the MM project or something like that. I want to pull one note, and then Carrie, I'm going to turn this to you. Leila, I love the optimism, right? Thank God, right? Like, let's be optimistic that this will get resolved. And as some of you know, I've taken students to Israel to study conflict. Last year, we went to Northern Ireland, and for about 10 of them, they got to compare this because we had done this back to back. And in the example of my security fence, right, we had seen the fences in Israel, and then we saw them in Belfast. Belfast blows you out of the water. Those things, they make Israel look like child's play in terms of security barriers, because they are unbelievably high to prevent Molotov cocktails and everything else being, you know, literally launched over them right in between neighborhoods, and with murals that are petrifying. So it's this really interesting thing that when we think about Northern Ireland or South Africa, we say it's resolved. And yes, it's resolved in that most times, most people are going about their business. They're not focused on the conflict, and that the death toll from the conflict has dropped dramatically. But it's not necessarily peace, right? And I think that's one of the interesting things when we look at both the legacy from Camp David of, yes, Egypt and Israel haven't gone to war since then, but it's not a relationship. And even in South Africa and Northern Ireland, there's still what to do. There's still injustice. There's still unfairness. There's still communities that never talk to one another. But Carrie, let me turn this to you to just a little more reflection on peace versus justice, resolution, and all of those big picture questions.
Thanks, Andrea. I want to just quickly pick up on some of the things that all of you said. I, too, have spent a whole bunch of time in Northern Ireland. And as Andrea says, some of those murals are positively shocking, but they also raise a very important issue in dispute resolution practice, and that is the use of comparisons. So when we're in Israel, we do like to say, what can we learn from Northern Ireland and South Africa? So let me say two things. Those murals were, at least the ones I saw, were extraordinary in their incorrectness, their falseness about history. You talk about false facts. There were Palestinian and Israeli flags planted in Catholic and Protestant homes. And ironically, the Catholics had Confederate flags also from the in the days of high conflict, because they identified with the rebels, right? The Catholics were rebelling from the Protestant Northern Irish majority. And so they identified with the Palestinians and with the Confederates as rebels, without seeing the danger of identifying for American peace helpers with Confederacy, which is hardly justice. And so I just want to say, we learn from past conflicts. I love to talk about both the advantage and disadvantages of analogical thinking. We want to take the positive messages and be careful not to apply things in different contexts. I do want to pick up on what LELA said also about South Africa, and I don't know if my dear friend Roby Domlin's in the audience or not, but she made a film with a parent circle. She's a South African who moved to Israel a long time ago and lost a son in the conflict, and has made a series of wonderful educational films, real film about real things. And in one of her films, The Day After Tomorrow, I recommend to all of you, a film, Roby and others, and the parent circle on the Palestinian side too, began to propose having some equivalent of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission before there's peace. So that picks up on Andrea's point. There hasn't been a lot of major death and killing at the moment, but we all know it could start at any time. And the creativity in that proposal is, rather than waiting for Nelson Mandela to be released, rather than waiting for a two-state solution, rather than waiting for some fancy diplomatic peace signing of a treaty, this is another way to do the M2M thing, I suppose, to try to have states, governments, whether it's the US or the Israeli government or the Palestinian Authority or whoever, create an institution of some kind, temporary perhaps, but authorized, to have some of those people-to-people conversations in public. And the final thing I'll say is, I'm hopeful too. And picking up on Art's point, I think both of our countries, sorry, I'm going to get into trouble politically, need a change of leadership. And notice the change of leadership in the United States didn't mean a new generation. That would be nice too. But we're taking our cues from an old guy who's saying, I've seen a lot of pain personally and internationally, and I want to step back from that pain.
All the things you're talking about sound very important and also reasonable to sort of open-minded people or maybe democratic regimes. But how interested would authoritarian regimes like Iran or Syria or Turkey be in the sorts of conflict resolution that you're talking about?
Can I start? And then I'll hand it off, since I seem to have started a lot of things here.
Trouble.
So, well, one of the things that's interesting here is, right, you have to go back to interest. It has to be in their interest. It has to be worth their time. They have to see, this is the crass way to say it is, what's in it for me, right? What's in it for them? There has to be something in it for them. And this is where LELA and CARRIE were talking about, well, we've got a lot of cash payments to, for the Camp David Accords, and they're still happening, and this is quite some time. And so those cash payments made it worth individuals' times. And so the question was, we came close again in the early 90s with Clinton, and there was going to be more cash payments to different groups. And it got right to the finish line and then fell apart right there at the last moment. So this is the idea of interest, right? What makes it worth somebody's time to come to the table? That's the question. That's the question that needs to be answered. And there are a lot of smart people who are working on that. And it's not just an easy thing to figure out because, right, you have to understand the political framework in each of the countries and what it is. And so, for example, in the United States, we have this example that only Nixon could go to China. Only Nixon, because he was the staunch anti-communist. Nobody's going to ever say that he was a communist. Right. So only he could do it. And so we have to figure out sort of what those things are on the ground in other places. And with that, I hand it off to my colleagues.
I'll just echo briefly what Art said. What is the interest that will bring this particular country to the table on this particular issue? And I'll just quickly say, I am a pragmatist. I said that. I'm also a believer in incrementalism and that we need to go step by step. And the efforts to try to, I've spent a lot of time, as all you have, in Israel, looking for the solutions to the four major problems: Jerusalem, right of return, all of that stuff. Every time we try to do the big picture, it gets killed by somebody. And I say myself, let's start step by step. So I'm a believer in focusing on an interest that would get somebody to the table and agree to something. And hopefully on that, we can build future other bigger agreements.
We have a global pandemic right now. We have this worry about climate change and the destruction of our planet and life as we know it. What other surprises are down the road? That's going to have these surprises, perhaps some good ones, are going to have a major impact bringing people to the table who look intractable now. What if we could offer vaccines to everybody tomorrow? What if we, so I just want to throw that in. We're focusing on the critical conflict in Israel, but these other, sometimes an external enemy like COVID or like what's happening to our climate can have a huge impact.
Okay, thank you. I think it was Golda Meir who said that pessimism is a luxury that Israel cannot afford. So I think Israelis generally need to be optimistic.
Toda rabah.
Bye. Bye.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.